Thank you so much for that introduction, Joe. Can you still hear me okay?
You sound great.
Perfect. And thanks everyone for joining the webinar. I appreciate your time and I'm glad you were able to tune into this. This is a kind of a passion project of mine, is talking about barrier removals and aquatic organism passage. Part of my job, as Joe had introduced, is I'm a fish biologist with the Partnerships and Habitat branch with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And part of my job is administering the National Fish Passage Program and the National Fish Habitat Partnerships within the Lake Michigan Basin. And so I get to see a lot of these neat projects and on the ground restoration in my job, and want to share some of the introduction to the ideas of them and some of the successful restoration projects with you all today. So first, going into why am I talking about barrier removals in lake systems? Sometimes restoration work can be focused on a singular system and promoting efforts within that one system. So think of like shoreline restoration within a lake or a stream remeandering within a river. But it's really the intersection of these two systems of lentic and lotic, of still water and moving water, that can be really crucial for biodiversity and ecosystem health. Many species move throughout their life, actively seeking different habitat types to fulfill their life history needs. For instance, Lake Sturgeon, which is the largest fish and the most long-lived species in the Midwest, they live most of their adult life in lake systems, feeding on food that they find at the benthos or the bottom of the lake. But they require fast-flowing rocky rivers to reproduce. And they migrate sometimes hundreds of miles into these river systems to lay their eggs in these rocky areas. And then the larval fish that hatch from these eggs, they seek out a nursery habitat that is slower moving within the river and that has a gravel and sand mixed substrates. So here are three very different habitat types: the lake systems, a fast moving river and a slow moving river, and one species that needs a multitude of habitats. And it's really that intersection and the connectivity of these systems that determine our biodiversity and if species can thrive. So, and just as important for the organisms, the connectivity between the lakes and the rivers helps that ecosystem itself function. As migratory species are moving into rivers and lakes, they often bring nutrients that are going to jumpstart the food chain in the spring. And then this pulse of nutrients promotes zooplankton, invertebrate, and algae growth, which can kickstart the food chain into spring production. This has been noted recently by researchers at the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago, where they've tracked how white sucker migrations from lakes into river systems in the springtime is jumpstarting and bringing in that dynamic change that is helping move and awaken the rivers within the springtime. And then reconnecting rivers and lake systems can also help restore the natural flow between them. It can mitigate the effects of flooding events by allowing water to disperse throughout the watershed more readily. And we also see that this connection helps restore the function of woody debris movement, of nutrient cycling, and of sediment distribution throughout. So what is aquatic organism passage? I'll be referring to aquatic organism passage as AOP throughout the presentation. And AOP is the ability of the species to move throughout a system and access all the habitats necessary to complete their life cycle. It can also be the action of removing barriers to reopen access to stream, wetland, and lacustrine or lake habitats. A barrier for aquatic organism passage is anything that prevents or reduces the ability of a species to be able to move where they need to so that they can survive and complete their life cycle. And most of the time we think of these barriers as something physical, like a dam or a culvert. And more often than not, they are a physical barrier. But barriers can also be abiotic or environmental. So it could be a lot of sedimentation that's coming into a system that's reducing water quality. It can be high water temperatures. It can be low oxygen levels or other poor water quality variables that when a species encounters it, they're not likely to move through it and it becomes a barrier for passage. And we often see that high water, which is very much an environmental barrier, can be a velocity barrier and its own type of barrier all on its own, as well as low water. So sometimes systems naturally dewater due to seasonal changes, and sometimes it's due to human intervention. And then oftentimes we can see that there is a mix of these factors that are acting as multiple barriers. So for instance, an undersized culvert at a road is causing high water velocity through the pipe that a species can't get through. It's also pooling water upstream that's increasing the water temperature. And we're also seeing low oxygen associated with that. So oftentimes these barriers, both physical and environmental, can be compounding. But why is this bad and what does this mean? When connectivity is blocked, populations can become disconnected from one another. And oftentimes this can result in populations losing their genetic diversity. The population can become less sustainable, less resilient to disturbances, not able to cope with changes within the system, including climate change, and they're not able to adapt to those changing conditions. And in the end, this can lead to local population loss, which we can call extirpation, or even the extinction of species. So I just want to give you an idea of some of these common barriers that we often see in smaller river systems associated with some of our lake environments. And these are pretty prevalent throughout the Midwest. And these are culverts at a road stream crossing, or an area where the road crosses over top of stream that has a pipe, or the culvert that is the conduit to move water through it. And many times these are undersized or malformed, and it becomes a barrier within the stream systems, and oftentimes barriers to the lake systems. But we can restore aquatic organism passage by removing the barriers and replacing them with better structures that allow access and connectivity. In the pictures you see here, this is Halley Creek in northeast Wisconsin, and there's a series of undersized culverts, and I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but there's one small culvert here towards the left, a small culvert in the middle, and then a larger one here to the right. And the series of culverts were installed over time to increase the flow capacity, and it ended up creating a velocity barrier and elevated the risk of debris like large trees that become lodged between the structure's inlets and impounding the flows, so causing more water quality and flooding issues. So water moved too fast through the culvert, and there was no structure within the culvert that allowed fish or turtles to be able to rest behind it as they were trying to mitigate through. And so it became a complete barrier. And barriers like this also create upstream ponding that can disrupt how sediment flows within a system. And so you can get sediment building upstream and then sediment starvation downstream. It can also interrupt the transport of wood. And so you get a similar thing where you get a compounding impact of wood upstream, but no wood or cover or habitat downstream. And all of this can impact the thermal properties that reduce the habitat condition for cold water species, such as brook trout. So this new structure that you see on the right was designed to improve aquatic organism passage and flood resiliency and help restore the natural stream function. This Halley Creek Barrier Removal Project connected 7.2 miles of upstream critical cold water refugia in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. So it was a success for removing a barrier and helping to establish aquatic organism passage. But not all times is there the ability to be able to physically remove the barrier. So in this example, this is the Mequon-Thiensville Dam, and this is in Ozaukee County, Wisconsin, near Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And you can see the dam in the lower right side of the picture. So here where my cursor is, where you see that line of white water, that's the water moving very fast over the dam. In this instance, it wasn't feasible or desirable to remove the dam, yet aquatic connectivity was restored to the system by creating a Fishway Bypass around the dam. And as fish are swimming upstream, and so as they are swimming upstream towards the dam, there is an attractant flow that is coming out of the fishway that is circled here with my cursor. So the fish or aquatic organisms will enter, and then there's a series of ponds, which are kind of those round areas within the fishway. So a series of pools and ponds that they can rest in. And then there's also some structure and rocks and riffles that are put in to mimic natural stream design. And so organisms can now traverse and go around the dam. The dam still functions as it wasn't intended to, but we can allow aquatic organism passage to upstream areas of the system. So we've talked a little bit about how restoring connectivity is good for species and good for ecosystem function, but it's also just as important that restoring connectivity is good for people. By creating resilient and sustainable fish populations, we're improving recreational and commercial fishing. Restoring ecosystem function and species diversity supports and enhances cultural resources and traditions. And improved ecological function returns to us as flood resiliency and improved infrastructure to reduce storm impacts and improve public safety. And then the aesthetics and the recreational opportunities that are brought about by reconnecting systems by having well-connected and free-flowing lakes and rivers, it helps build local support for people to protect and feel a sense of connection to aquatic systems. So the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership recognizes the importance of barrier removal and aquatic organism passage in lake systems. And their mission is to work in partnership to protect, rehabilitate, and enhance sustainable fish habitats in glacial lakes of the Midwest for the use and enjoyment of current and future generations. And this speaks directly to the type of habitat connectivity and restoration work that we're talking about. In fact, the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership has funded several barrier removals and habitat connectivity projects over the past couple of decades. And so I want to showcase some of these projects and the impacts that they've had to the systems and how we as a community of scientists and supporters can come together and move in the future towards building some of these resilient systems between lakes and streams. So the first one that I'm going to showcase is Prairie Lake and the Lake Lizzy dam removals. And so this image here in the bottom corner, you can see the state of Minnesota. The watershed is highlighted in gray, and we are looking at the Pelican River watershed. And there were multiple dams acting as barriers to upstream fish passage. The first two were the Dutton Locks and the Fish Lake Rock Arch Fishway. And one of the biggest impacts was to not just sport fish, but to the local lake sturgeon population. Lake sturgeon were historically found throughout the entire system within Pelican River. But as the dams were installed in the early 1900s, the sturgeon were no longer able to freely migrate upstream to access the unique habitats that were in these upper parts of the river. And they were basically relegated down to these lower sections of the river. And so their populations became extirpated in many parts of the Pelican River. And rather than being able to connect from lake to lake and river to river within that chain, they were mostly just found in this upper part in Detroit Lake and what's called Little Floyd Lake here. So the Minnesota DNR worked to remove two dams within the system, that Dutton Locks and Fish Lake. And then there were two more dams that were still in place. And the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership worked with the DNR to help provide support to them and multiple other stakeholders for the restoration efforts to modify these two remaining dams, the Lake Lizzy Dam and the Prairie Lake Dam. And by modifying them into arch rapids, they allowed for aquatic organism passage and then lake sturgeon to access the habitats that they had been disconnected from since the early 1900s. And this increased connectivity helped the fish community become more resilient to disturbance and better able to adapt to changing conditions, including climate change. And so this is a picture of the Lake Lizzy Dam here in the top, and then the Prairie Lake Dam here in the bottom. And so Lake Lizzy Dam, when it was removed in 2020, this is what it looked like before in the top picture, and then afterwards. The dam was removed, and these are called arch rapids that were put in place that can still allow fish to traverse through them. And then this is what Prairie Lake Dam looked like before, and then after the restoration efforts. And so this connected hundreds of miles and acres of lake and river habitat throughout the Pelican River system. The next project that I want to showcase is Lake Carlos, and this is in Douglas County, Minnesota. There was an outlet dam on Lake Carlos that you can see here. And so this is the top of the lake, and the outlet dam was coming out of the river, or excuse me, out of the lake into the river system. And so you have this one small dam as the conduit of water leaving this massive lake system. And it prevented the free movement between the lake and the river environment. And the barrier prevented migrating fish like walleye, northern pike, and multiple sucker species from returning to Lake Carlos. So there was an out-migration of the fish. They were leaving Lake Carlos. They would swim up into the river system to reproduce. And then as they came back to Lake Carlos, they encountered this dam and they weren't able to return. And so they were actually starting to note a decrease in recreational fishing opportunities and fishermen's catch because there was this continued out-migration of sport fish that were no longer able to return to the system. So the dam was removed and converted into an arch rapids to help reestablish the connectivity between Lake Carlos and the Long Prairie River. And the project was really fascinating from my perspective. So you can see that this dam here then became this wide open, free-flowing river system. Some of these rapids are in place just to help with the natural flow of the river as it's leaving the lake. But this project is fascinating because it also benefited several rare freshwater mussel species, including the creek hill splitter and the black sand-shelled mussels, because they provided access to the critical habitat between Lake Carlos and those river systems. So if you're new to the world of freshwater mussels, buckle up because I'm going to give you a real quick introduction to them. Freshwater mussels rely on host fish for their reproduction. Their larvae, which are called glochidia, attached to the gills or the fish of a host, and they stay attached to the host, usually for a couple weeks at a time. This does not impact or hurt the fish. And then they transform into their juvenile stage after a couple weeks, and they drop off of their host fish. And so mussels are very reliant upon fish to be able to disperse them to new habitats. And so when you have a barrier to fish passage, that's also going to be a barrier to the dispersal for mussels. And so all of the things that I talked about at the beginning, the loss of genetic diversity, resiliency within populations, that impacts very much freshwater mussel populations. And so after the mussels transform and kind of settle into their new habitat, that's when they can continue to proliferate, and we can see like healthier, sustainable mussel populations that come from these passage projects as well. So when there's a barrier in place that blocks fish access, it's also going to block movement, dispersal of freshwater mussels. And reconnecting Lake Carlos to the Long Prairie River system, it helped increase the populations of both of those two freshwater mussel populations, which was a great success story for them. Okay, the next project I want to showcase is over on the Michigan side. And this is reconnecting Mason Creek to Duck Lake in Grand Traverse County, Michigan. So there was a road stream crossing over Mason Creek that was just upstream of the confluence of Duck Lake. And the crossing was comprised of two 4-foot diameter culverts. So you can see this here is the inlet of the culvert where the water is coming into it. This is the outlet where water is coming out. So two very small culverts, they're perched, meaning there's kind of this waterfall at the other end that most fish will not be able to jump to get into. So it becomes a velocity barrier, it becomes a jumping barrier, and it's a physical barrier as well. So these undersized culverts, they're significantly undersized for the size of the stream. Now remember, this is draining this entire lake system that I believe was 1,900 acres is Duck Lake, and it's all coming out of these two very small pipes. So there was a variety of fish species that were found in Mason Creek, including brook trout and mottled sculpin. But the surveys found that the populations upstream and downstream of the outlet were significantly different. And so the sizes were different, the year classes, the age structures of the fish. And what they found is that this barrier was not allowing the passage of fish back and forth. And so you saw one very small population at the upstream end, and then a larger, more robust population at the downstream end, and they couldn't mix. So through this project, the partners designed and completed the installation of a timber bridge that accommodates the natural stream channel and allows natural movement of substrate, water, fish, and wildlife during all stream events within the system. And this connected 8 miles of Mason Creek and its forested corridor, which provided spawning and escape cover for fish migration. It reconnected it to Duck Lake system, which is 1,900 acres. And this helped restore the site, or excuse me, restoring the site prevents an annual input of 4 tons of sediment from the crossing and roadway, and it improves the in-stream gravel and wood habitat for aquatic insects and the fish and the wildlife that feed on them. So after restoration was complete, they documented that there were several ages of brook trout that were found both upstream and downstream of of Mason Creek, showing that they were then successfully reproducing and being able to traverse the system. And then they were also finding, so this is a small brook trout in this top fish photo here. And in the bottom one, this is a picture of a mottled sculpin that was surveyed out of the system. And mottled sculpin are really important because they're classified as sensitive indicator species. So when we find them within a system, it indicates that it's good water quality. And so being able to reconnect Duck Lake to this upstream habitat within Mason Creek was really important. And the benefits within the fish and wildlife populations were seen immediately. Okay. The next one that I want to showcase is Crane Lake, which is in Otter Tail County, Minnesota. And it's part of a chain of lake systems in west central Minnesota. And on Crane Lake, just like we've seen in a couple of these other examples, this is a very large lake system. So Crane Lake, sorry, I was circling on the wrong screen. Crane Lake is this lake right here, and it drains down into Catherall Lake. And again, there was a very small pipe that is the outlet. So this entire lake system just had one culvert. It was undersized and it was perched at the outlet. And so the entire lake was connected by this small pipe and essentially disconnected from the rest of this chain of lake systems for the aquatic organisms that are living in them. So the Crane Lake Fish Passage Project reconnected upstream Crane and Belmont Lake. So this Belmont Lake here, water flows downstream this way. It reconnected them to the Clitheroe Lake system. And this is really important for game species such as walleye and northern pike for them to move between these lakes. And it helped provide more resilient fish populations and increase the recreational fishing opportunities within those lake systems. So before the restoration occurred, Crane Lake had lower populations of migratory fish species such as walleye and white sucker. And they also had a lower population of a fish called a weed shiner, which is a species of greatest conservation need compared to the other lakes within the system. And so this is one more picture of that perched culvert at the outlet of Crane Lake. And this was a velocity barrier, and in some water flows, also a jump barrier for aquatic organism passage. And they weren't able to move within the lake systems. And because the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership prioritized this kind of work with partners, they funded the replacement of this undersized perch culvert to one that was more appropriately sized and connected these lake systems back to each other. So this helped improve habitat connectivity and it increased recreational fishing opportunities to the upstream lake systems. And then the last project that I want to showcase for you all is called the Knutson Dam Project. And this is located in the Chippewa National Forest. And this is part of the Mississippi watershed. And the Mississippi River flows at the outlet of the north shore of Cass Lake. So this is Cass Lake here and the Mississippi watershed coming out of the north side of it. And it flows into a large chain of lake systems in the upper watershed of the Mississippi River. So this red star here on the map, this indicates the outlet of Cass Lake into the Mississippi River. And there is a dam that I'm going to show in the next slide that became a barrier for aquatic organism passage. So where that red star was, this is what the dam looked like. And this is the Knutson Dam. And this was built in the early 1900s for logging within the system. And it blocked fish passage completely between Cass Lake and the upper Mississippi River system. And so the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnerships worked in collaboration with a multitude of partners to remove the dam, and they replaced the structure with the rapids that you can see here in the two pictures on the right. And these actions helped restore fish passage in over 30 miles of the upper Mississippi River and its tributaries. And this includes 72,000 acres of lakes in the upper watershed that were completely disconnected from the rest of the chain of lake system because of the dam that was in place. So this project was also important to improve safety and public access because the former dam was deteriorating. And you can see there was previously a walkway across the dam here, and it wasn't safe for pedestrian use. And so this was good for recreational fishing, for aquatic organism conservation, and for public safety and use. So the interconnection of lake and stream systems is crucial for biodiversity and biotic integrity and resilience within systems. And it helps to create our functional systems. And I don't think that oftentimes we give enough attention to the connection between lakes and rivers. We focus very much, as like I'd mentioned earlier, on those single systems themselves and actions within those systems. But restoring the connectivity between either lake to lake or lake to streams is really important. And partnerships like MGLP are at the forefront of restoring and conserving these systems. And removing barriers that have caused decades of detrimental impacts is now going to support healthy, connected aquatic communities for generations to come. So for everyone who's joining or listening to the webinar, I would encourage you to consider collaborative projects like the ones that I was showcasing here that are looking at barrier removal and aquatic organism passage associated with glacial lake systems, and then reaching out to the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership to discuss potential project ideas. So with that, I would like to have kind of a discussion with everybody and some questions that you might have about this, but I want to leave you with this quote real quick from Flip Pallett. He's a legendary fisher and outdoor recreation and conservation advocate. And I believe that habitat work, like removing barriers that disconnect aquatic organisms and habitats, is at the heart of successful restoration. And it's our best tool for moving forward to create resilient ecosystems and to protect biodiversity. And Flip is quoted saying, "We can never solve fisheries problems by employing the same methods we used to create them. Complete commitment to habitat is the single piece of the puzzle that has never been employed, and now it's time." And so I'd like you all to kind of carry that forward and think about how we can work on removing some of these older barriers within our waterways and reconnecting systems, both for the benefit of people and organisms and the systems themselves. So my contact information is listed here, and I want to thank Joe and Eric for their help and support in getting the webinar running. And I think I'm finishing a little bit early, but I would like to take some time to kind of have an open dialogue and answer some questions, or go back and revisit some of the projects if I skimmed over them too fast.
Thanks so much, Jessica. That was really great. And we do indeed have some questions. A few have come in during your talk.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I'll also encourage folks that are listening. There's quite a few of you on the webinar. We've got lots of time for questions, so use that Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen to type your questions in, and we'll go through them with Jessica. So let's start one out. We have a question from John. Do you have any examples of dams being replaced with dry dams, which only impound water during times of floods?
I do not for this specific partnership that so most of the ones that I was showcasing were projects that were funded through MGLP. And I don't have examples of those, but those are quite effective. They can still be a passage barrier from time to time, but it's more of a seasonal barrier. And we've also seen these employed sometimes for barriers to invasive species during certain times of the year. So sorry, John, I don't have any examples to bring up.
Thanks. Another question that's come in. Many lakes have what they refer to as lake level control structures, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're used primarily to maintain a desired lake level. That can be really important to property owners around the lake. And so kind of more of a theoretical question is do you have thoughts about how to balance that desired maintenance of lake level with the fish community needs and the lake needs? Are there designs that might be more fish friendly that we could communicate to stakeholders? Is there education that we should be doing that maybe we're not doing enough of?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There are some designs that are a little bit more fish friendly. There's a lot of examples of how water flow control structure can be implemented to help achieve both the water levels within the lake, but also aquatic organism passage. A lot of it depends on a case-by-case basis. So what the size of the lake, the species that are impacted, their timings of their migrations, and when they're moving. And so the species that are being targeted for return that are not able to access it, there's ways that you can open up water control structures during times of the year that they are going to be migrating back into a system. And there's also different types of fish passage ways. Some are passive, like that fishway that I showed on the Milwaukee River. And some are more active that we've seen in some areas where there are weir that's operated by biologists that are, operating it during times of the year where they know fish are going to be coming through, and they're selecting which fish get passed through. Oftentimes we see this when there's invasive species. And so there's some great resources that I'll need to follow up. Sorry, I should have had some links ready for you. But there are some great resources on how to balance the need for water level control structures with species assemblages. I can say that sometimes there's usually a little bit of a sacrifice that needs to happen. Sometimes the exact lake levels can't be controlled to the way that people want if they're trying to actively benefit a fish species. And so there's a little bit of work and give and take between the two to help find that right balance for making it work.
All right, and thank you for that. And you segued a little bit into the invasive species issue, and a question came in along those lines. Henry asks, are there any concerns of reopening passage between lakes that might allow invasive species to spread?
Yes, great question, Henry. That is always a concern. And so when we're working on habitat connectivity and barrier removals, that's one of the first things that we look at as well, is what are the invasive species that are within the system, and is this going to be facilitating their spread? And it's one of the risks that we look at and try to weigh out the benefits or the cost benefit analysis of doing this type of work. I can tell you that there are instances in Lake Michigan when we have a terminal barrier. So this is a dam that is the lowest dam on a river system that's connecting Lake Michigan to its tributaries. Oftentimes, because of sea lamprey, if there's a terminal barrier, we may not take that barrier out because the risk of introducing sea lamprey and proliferating their numbers, or the risk of then needing to treat for sea lamprey in a system that hadn't been treated before is too high. So that's one of the things that we always consider and weigh and look at our options. One thing that I do want to touch on real quick is that we're trying to devise ways that we can actively remove barriers and then have a seasonal barrier up that could potentially keep out certain species. And this is focusing right now on sea lamprey. And so if we have a terminal barrier, the opportunity to remove it, reconnect the systems to each other and allow aquatic organism passage, but then actively monitor it and put up a temporary barrier in the springtime as when we know that sea lamprey are actively migrating, and monitoring it and removing the barrier as soon as migration is done, or doing some kind of facilitated passage like a weir where we're selecting which species are moving up into the system. Those are all ways that we're trying to balance that the need to keep invasive species out of areas where they are no longer, or that they currently aren't found, because we definitely don't want to facilitate the spread or the harmful impacts they could have. That's a good question, Henry.
All right, keep those questions coming in, everyone, using that Q&A box. Of course, we're thankful for Jessica to mention MGLP, the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, as a potential funding partner for some of these barrier removal projects. But Jessica, do you know of any other funding sources or funding models that are out there for communities or jurisdictions that might be looking at removing or modifying an existing barrier?
Yeah. Absolutely. The first one that comes to mind is the one that I administer for the Lake Michigan Basin, and it's called the National Fish Passage Program. And National Fish Passage Program is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service program that helps remove barriers and facilitate aquatic organism passage. And this is across the U.S. So in the Great Lakes region, each lake basin has its own coordinator for it. So I coordinate for Lake Michigan. And if you're around the Lake Michigan base, or excuse me, the Great Lakes, I can connect you with the other coordinators. But the National Fish Passage Program website also can connect you to each of the regional coordinators that are associated with it. And it's an excellent funding opportunity for people who are interested in looking at barrier removal and habitat connectivity. There are also some other programs that I can't speak to directly, but I know that some partners have looked towards. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NFWIF. They have a couple different programs. They're Bring Back the Natives, that's focused on brook trout. Their Fund for Lake Michigan, the Great Lakes Fisheries Trust, and GLRI all have different funding opportunities that are associated with habitat connectivity, habitat restoration, and passage. And so those are some of the higher up federal opportunities that I'm aware of. But I'll have to think off the top of my head. I can't think of some of the maybe nonprofits or other opportunities that come to mind. Those are kind of the bigger ones I think of.
All right, that's great information for us to have. Henry had a follow-up question, a little different topic, but first I'll just read what he had to say. Thanks for the answer. It was really interesting. I have one other quick question. What is the typical maintenance and lifespan of engineered fish passage solutions?
Henry, I don't have a good response for that because I don't know. I know it depends on the type. So the Fishway that I showed earlier, and allow me if you don't mind, I'm going to buzz through my slides real quick back to this so you can see which one I'm talking about. This is that Fishway that's on the Milwaukee River. This one was, I believe, installed in 2009, and it has taken several iterations of ongoing management and kind of recalibration to the Fishway. There is a sediment trap that, and I'm sorry, you can't quite see it on this picture, but right between the words Thiensville and dam, there's a sediment trap that's supposed to help assist. But this kind of Fishway, depending on the system that it's in, depending on the amount of sediment and silt and that's within it, would take a little bit of regular, probably dredging every few years. And so it's not a one and done. It would take maintenance from every few years to ensure that it's still functioning the way that it's intended to, that it's still connected. One thing that we came back to on this was after the original engineering and design, we found that the water flowing through the Fishway was actually a little too fast. And we had to come back through and do a little bit more engineering. That's when a lot of these pool areas, the size of them was increased. We added more rock and boulder as cover because we found that it was just a little bit too much of a velocity issue for fish. So Henry, your question on, how much time and maintenance or how often do you have to come back to these? I would say pretty regularly. I don't know that there's any solution that you can just set it and forget it. Most of the time, the work that we're doing to create passage around, whether it's a weir that has to be, people need to work on it, every year to actively select fish, whether it's a Fishway like this is a little bit more passive. I think all of them are going to have some kind of maintenance into the future for the lifespan of it. And I think that's just part of the way of how some of these systems operate. And, the natural flow of the river probably would want to take over and kind of reroute within that Fishway. And so I don't think you could ever create a solution that you would set and forget.
All right, thanks, Jessica. We had a comment come in. We have Crystal here from Minnesota. She actually was the one who designed the project on Lake Carlos. And she made a comment that she actually thinks that the after photo might be from a different project that you showed.
Oh.
She sees that might be from the Pelican Lake group of projects.
Oh, I'm so sorry if I mixed those up. Thank you for catching that.
Yeah, I mean, your takeaway messages, I'm sure, were the same, but, a helpful feedback from someone involved with that project.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I was going through our reports and it's entirely likely that I grabbed the wrong photo from the wrong file. So apologies for misrepresenting the results of that.
All right. Yeah. And we did have another note from Henry. He said he asked his question about maintenance because we are struggling with maintaining these structures in Sweden. Many are one and done and need more long-term care. So thanks for the helpful information.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I just kind of want to follow up with that too, monitoring, long-term monitoring of any habitat restoration project, I think is really important and something that we should actively plan for as we plan these projects, because doing a restoration and walking away, oftentimes, a natural system has its own way of functioning and flowing, and what we design and what we expect it to do may not be the case. But also the solutions that we want to implement, because we are actively kind of trying to find a solution for what we've implemented or a problem that we've created, there's never going to be, I think, an easy walk away from it. I think we always need to have that follow-up and long-term monitoring, whether it is a fishway or some type of fish passage, or it's a complete removal. Understanding how the system returns to its function and form is important. And so I believe fully in long-term monitoring after these projects.
Okay, Jessica, another question going a little different direction from Ralph.
Sure.
Do you consider recreation opportunities such as whitewater kayaking or canoeing for the low dam barrier removal projects in addition to fish passage? Maybe this would help with funding for these projects.
Absolutely, Ralph. And that's a really great question and great perspective. And it's one that I tried to tie in a little bit too. And I think I talked mostly about the recreational fishing aspect, but we do, and I'm going to speak specifically to the National Fish Passage Program, but then also Midwest Glacial Lakes, part of their vision is ensuring it for recreational use by current and future generations. And so both of these programs, the National Fish Passage Program and Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, are also focused on the human dimension aspect to these projects and being able to connect people to the systems to get that buy-in from communities that are really interested in the resource itself, and being able to provide the opportunities for safe human use is really important. And we think about that quite a bit on dam removals, because sometimes these low head dams are a safety concern, and a lot of them are flagged by the states as safety issues on the river system. So being able to remove that safety issue and provide open recreational access for people is something that we oftentimes try to showcase, and then we try to leverage with our partners on other funding opportunities that we can bring to the table.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you for everyone's questions and attending today. I think we had a really great conversation and got to check out a number of different projects that are happening in our region. So thank you again, Jessica, for highlighting those and the role of the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership in those projects. So we're going to wrap up for now. Again, thank you all for joining. This was recorded, so you can always refer back to our website to view and share that recording within the next week or two. So thanks again and have a great afternoon.
Thanks everyone for joining.